Hello, everybody. Oh, oh, my, I'm sorry, my voice seems to,
Oh, wow. That's a lot better. My voice. It's all nice and not gritty. That must have been a pretty bad cough. Cool. But in all seriousness, a quick disclaimer this game is really bloody and really gruesome. Like, seriously, if you think about picking up this game or watching this video, be ready for gore. It is really, really, really gory. Like, excessive blood and all of that. So, if you're into that kind of stuff, probably want to stop watching here. Sorry, one more note. Before we get into the dialogue, I'm going to go into a description of some history into the Binding of Isaac and the description of the roguelike genre. If you don't really care about that stuff and want to go straight into the game analysis, you can jump to these timestamps right here. And with that stuff out of the way, let's get into it. The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus falls under the roguelike genre. So before we get into discussion about it, I think we should take a deep dive into the history of roguelikes. The subgenre roguelike derives itself from the game Rogue, which was developed in the late 1970s and became massively popular around 1980. In Rogue, you are a passionate, text-based adventurer put through a series of dungeon floors and enemies in turn-based combat, picking up loot along the way to your final destination, the Amulet of Yendor. Sounds intimidating. I don't really know what that is, but that's just kind of a cool name. The Amulets of Yendor. The Amulets of Yendor. The Amulets of... One of the big gimmicks of the game was once you died, you had to restart all the way back from the beginning, and face a newly generated dungeon, different from the one that you died in. This required you to make many, many attempts until you reached the end. And this formula worked, as the game was popular enough to gain sequels on consoles such as the Atari 8-bit and Commodore 64, and it had many other games made in its style. Soon enough, the genre was solidified in the gaming industry, with a plethora of games using its mechanic. Coming back to modern times, the now coined roguelike games often still share some of the basic concepts of their predecessor. The player scours a dungeon of some sort, which is randomly generated every time you play, you pick up loot on the way, when you die you restart from the beginning, the same old, the same old. The only big core difference is the lack of turn-based battle, which is often replaced in favor of real-time combat. However, the premise of repetition is nearly always present, and I guarantee you that there are very few roguelikes in which you can clear the boss in the first run. You will probably die a lot, but that's fine, that's the point. On the run you died on, you may have collected some sort of good loot, or maybe you better understand the enemy type that killed you and you're better able to defend against it on the next run, which will then benefit you on the next run and rinse and repeat. I really like this genre, just as a concept. It seems so interesting to me, the whole try and try again mechanic. I'm amazed that essentially the same game, repeated over and over again, can be so successful and so enticing to play. And apparently, many people agreed with me, as many, many modern roguelikes were and still are being created in very recent years, including The Binding of Isaac. The Binding of Isaac, as in the original game, was developed by Edmund Macmillan. Yes, that Edmund Macmillan. And Florin Himzel. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. It was made in Flash and released in September of 2011. Yes, Edmund had come out again and created another beloved classic to add to Super Meat Boy. From that point on, The Binding of Isaac became his main focus for many years, even taking some precedence over work on Super Meat Boy. And his work was well worth it. The game was a fun new take on the roguelike genre, mixing Zelda-like dungeons with the roguelike elements of dungeons randomly changing each run and restarting after every death, all combined with lots and lots of gore. However, it was made on Flash, so it was sort of prone to bugs and glitches, and there were limits on what Edmund could do with the game. It was also, being a Flash game, exclusive to PC. Edmund realized all this and decided to remake the game completely fresh, recoding it in C++ from scratch and releasing it as The Binding of Isaac Rebirth in 2014 for PC and PS4, in July of 2015 for the Xbox One, 3DS, and Wii U version. This was a massive success, and the player base quickly shot up for Rebirth. It was the original Binding of Isaac, but with much more polish, much more items, much more bosses, just more Isaac. Edmund released the game's DLC, Afterbirth, in October 2015 for PC, and in May 2016 for Xbox One and the PS4, with our present Afterbirth Plus being added on all platforms in January 2017, save for the Switch, as the port was released in March of the same year. Also, as a note, the original Binding of Isaac is now available on Steam, and it's $5, so if you're interested in the original Binding of Isaac, then go check it out. With our history out of the way, let's now dive into The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus. Quick note before we start, as stated in my brief history of Isaac segment, the Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus is a DLC of the Binding of Isaac Rebirth, which added a lot of additional floors, enemies, etc., but it's not its own separate game. So if I mention something and you play Rebirth and don't see any of it, that's why. Just a heads up. In the Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus, you play as little Isaac. That's kind of where my definite description of the game's plot ends. The story is made to be up to interpretation somewhat, it's a little loose, and I don't want to spoil any of it, so I won't discuss it and focus more on the gameplay. The core gameplay surrounds you scouring the many ever-changing Zelda-esque dungeon floors under your house, defeating bizarre enemies by shooting tears at them, and collecting items to loot along the way. Items can be gained in several different ways, either through item rooms, which are unlocked by keys gained from enemies, bought through the shop, which uses money gained through killing enemies as well, or through beating bosses. At the end of each dungeon is a mini-boss, and once it's beaten, you can progress further into the depths of the floor you're in. After a few mini-bosses, you run into a main boss, and beating that lets you play on another entirely new floor with a new set of dungeons until you beat that floor's boss, and so on and so forth. All main bosses except Mom, the first one, have to be unlocked. I don't want to go more in depth with the bosses, as I don't want to spoil anything, but there are a lot of them, and each boss has their own floor, which is pretty neat. Once these bosses are beaten, you also unlock a nice little ending sequence and cinematic for each one. There is also a greed mode, but I'm not really going to cover it in this video, as it's merely an extension of the main gameplay of Isaac, and I feel like it might knock me over the runtime, but if you all would like me to do a future video on it, hit me up in the comments. So, now that we know what the gameplay is, let's get into the analytics. First, what works so well in the Binding of Afterbirth Plus, which I will from now on just call Isaac? Well, for starters, the plethora of items in Isaac. Like, seriously, there are so many items, over 500, and I think these items are a paramount part of the game. These items are so fun and diverse, often having wacky effects that are a joy to discover and play with. This large pool of items also serves two very useful purposes. One, it incentivizes you to play to unlock them all. And by unlock, I mean only items that are unlocked will spawn in the dungeons. You don't get every item right off the bat, you have to complete some requisites to unlock a good number of the items, such as beating a certain boss a certain number of times or doing some specific task. This is a great way to convince players to keep playing. It's like achievements, but much better, because the items are useful to the game and have such variety that it's impossible to tell what item will do, and so you want to just try them all so you play the game more to get them. The second advantage to having so many items is it creates a massive possibility of item combinations. Isaac has the great addition of item combos. Often, items will combine with each other to produce unique effects. Not literally combine together into one item, but instead cause unique effects from each other's procs. For instance, the Spoon Bender item gives Isaac psychic tracking shots. Combine this with Brimstone, which lets Isaac shoot a large laser of blood, and you now have this giant, psychic blood beam. And that's from just combining two items. You can seriously go ham with this, as there's no limit to how many items you can carry, and multiple items can react with multiple other items, causing even more chaos. It can get so hectic at times that I have legitimately crashed the game from just how much the game has to process what is happening on screen. This is a super important feature that made Isaac so fun and special, and it fits perfectly with the already crazy feel of the game itself. I really love this part of Isaac because it just works so well. Sure, not every item combines into each other, as some are independent effects or flat multipliers of Isaac's stats, and not every item is great and works well with other items, but the sheer number of good items means that you are guaranteed to get something fun for every new run you do. And items are not the only thing that's in abundance, as another attribute of Isaac is there are a ton of playable characters. Each character has its own stats, effects, and sometimes their own permanent held items. Each brings a new mechanic or gimmick with it, from the Forgotten's melee bone attack and spirit switch to Apollyon's void ability. These characters are also unlocked through gameplay, adding more incentive to play to unlock them along with the items. Another strong suit of Isaac is its variety in enemies, bosses, and dungeons. Each enemy is just so well crafted, and they're such a delight to face off. The mini-bosses are very plentiful and extremely fun to go against, with each one being unique and just oozing charm and thought. The main bosses are so fun as well, a great challenge which requires some serious focus, later on plenty of items, and knowledge of the game. The dungeons are very well made, the random generating is very well done, and the scenery is very varied and detailed. Though some may disagree, I think the pixely but not totally pixely style fits super well here. The pixel art sort of reminiscing of the times when original Rogue and classic Zelda were made, but not too pixelated that it sacrifices good visuals. Music is also pretty nice, albeit a bit too much electric guitar for my preference, but it's still pretty on point, and often fits the mood very well. However, nothing in life is perfect, and neither is Isaac. So, where are the faults with the game? Isaac relies on the sporadic nature of new items, enemies, and bosses. All these insane first-time whoa moments. However, after a while, when you understand how a lot of the items work, have tried a lot of the fun combinations, and have beaten all the boss's enemies, the charm of Isaac kind of fades. Now it just feels like I'm repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Don't get me wrong, this does take a good while, tens of hours, but not a very long time, seeing as it's supposed to be an endless playing game. Now I know what you're saying. Frosif, plenty of great games have short lengths. Why can't Isaac then just have a short length? And yes, I agree. Plenty of great games have short lengths. But the issue is, the point of Isaac is there is no end. The only real, quote, end is beating the final bosses, getting every single achievement, and filling the bestiary item catalogs. Even then, this isn't the real end. You don't really get a sense of full and complete conclusion because there is no end. There isn't supposed to be. There shouldn't be an end. You should theoretically be able to play it over and over and over again, as it's a roguelike, which is why the game intentionally has no real end, no satisfying conclusion. To put this in perspective, think of, say, a battle royale. There is no real end to them. They have stories and lore, of course, but the game itself never really ends. It's not supposed to. Battle royale players often have 100 plus hours on them. They somehow got the repeat formula to work for them, but it just doesn't work as well for Isaac. To sum it up, the problem resides in the repeat formula itself. It works because of how much it can be replayed, but it also then kicks itself in the gut because this actually causes the game to have less playtime. I think the game is great, but I don't have a lot of hours on it compared to other games I played, simply because I kinda just got bored of its repetitiveness after a while. I had done so much. I had beaten the bosses, gotten the items, tried a ton of item combos, all the charm of the newness and unexpected insanity was just kind of gone. At that point, it just felt too repetitive, because at its core, it is. And yes, there are mods for PC which do add a lot more content, but that's not really a solution either, as one, that's just for PC, and two, again, there is no end, so any new mods will eventually get old and repetitive. Now, I know that there isn't really an easy fix for this, and this is sounding like more of a critique on the roguelike genre as a whole instead of just Isaac. However, I feel like the problem is exemplified in Isaac, because it relies so much on that first experience zaniness. Isaac relies on the feeling of fun and awe you get out of fighting an angel for the first time, or fighting a crazy insane item combo for the first time. It lacks something to make me feel like I wasn't just getting the same old after a while, something to spice it up every now and again. Of course, I'm no game developer, so I don't have the solution, and maybe there isn't a solution, or maybe you don't think it's a problem, which is also fair. However, I feel like this issue goes beyond opinion, as several of my friends have expressed similar feelings of the game. Now that isn't to say that this ruins the whole thing, this game is still amazing, but just bear in mind that if you play it, it may just become stale after a while. From its origins in an unknown text-based adventure, to flash game endeavor, to critically acclaimed masterpiece, The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus is definitely up there in terms of roguelikes, and I had such a blast playing it. Its huge number of items and the many possible combos with them, the great enemies and bosses, the amazing scenery, and just the craziness of it all lead to an extremely fun and engaging game. The original Binding of Isaac incredibly utilized the roguelike genre while adding a lot of unique and interesting mechanics to the mix, and Afterbirth Plus takes this and pushes it to excellence. I love to see this kind of looked over genre get some real lovin', and I feel like the Binding of Isaac and its sequels were the catalyst that led to a lot of creators getting the competence to develop new roguelikes. However, it does have its faults, as any game does, and in Isaac's case, its core mechanic is flawed, since replayability doesn't last for an extremely long time. However, those hours that you do spend playing the game will be filled with fun times, I guarantee you. All in all, to sum it up as sort of a review of the game, if you're into roguelikes or want somewhere to start with the genre, I highly recommend this. But if you're looking for long-lasting, like hundreds of hours of gameplay game, and you're not really feeling like you're into the roguelike rinse and repeat no end style, this may just not be a choice you want to pick up. In my personal opinion, please go buy it. I know it's not long, but it's so fun while it lasts, and not long is still tens of hours. It totally gets a double thumbs up from me. Final note, Afterbirth Plus is DLC of Rebirth, so I do highly recommend that you get the DLC. Even though Rebirth is Afterbirth Plus, as Afterbirth Plus is just DLC, it adds so much cool stuff to be completely worth it. I would really recommend getting it if you can. However, if you can't, that's totally fine, as Rebirth is the core game. And the only thing Afterbirth Plus adds are a number of items, bosses, achievements, and greed mode. They share the really important gameplay mechanics, so don't get too worried if you can't get the DLC, but I really do recommend it if you can get it. If anyone is interested in a more in-depth comparison of the two, then be sure to hit me up in the comments. And that concludes my first Gamer's Dialogue, a series I hope to do for a bit about the intricacies of games, along with their histories, pros and cons, and general analysis of them. If you want to see more, please let me know, as I'd really love to keep doing them for you. And that's all I got, so have a nice day, and see you later.